active. Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on critical race theory, the what, the why, and how, a lens in addressing the influence of race, racism, and diversity and equity in schooling. At this moment, I would like to call on Dean Mario Martinez to give us a short greetings and introduction. Dr. Martinez.
Good evening. As a Dean in the School of Education, I first want to welcome you to this evening's event. As I read the participants and we're climbing steadily, this will likely be the biggest webinar event that we have had in the Center for Educational Justice. Thanks to our co-director, Dr. Jose Lawless, and our participating School of Education faculty and other contributors who you will soon meet. Thank you, participants, for making the time to join us on what has become a controversial yet important topic. Controversy and importance, those are two things that make critical race theory an ideal topic for an academic institution and a Center for Educational Justice to talk about, discuss, and debate tonight. Practically speaking, we in California are in the midst of a teacher shortage. EdSource reports, and I quote, "A decrease in the number of teacher candidates entering credentials, as well as the possibility of increased retirements and resignations, will make it increasingly difficult for schools to hire all the teachers they need. Not only do we need teachers in numbers, but we need culturally competent teachers who know how to effectively talk, teach, discuss, and dialogue about important critical topics such as race, diversity, equity, and inclusion." Discussions on such topics as critical race theory are important to unpack. Consider how much better we all are than over the last year, as we have been immersed in similar discussions about important concepts such as DEI and anti-racism. How are these two concepts related? How are they different? What are the assumptions and implications of each? How are people defining them? How can these ideas inform practice? Tonight, you will certainly find yourself thinking about such questions, but as they relate to critical race theory. If you end tonight with even more questions and even a bigger appetite to dig deeper into critical race theory, then I submit to you that we will have been successful as a center in executing our mission. I'd like to make a couple of quick observations about the school's philosophy and approach as we prepare for our discussion with you tonight on critical race theory. This topic, first of all, bridges with our vision and mission. Our vision is to inspire more justice-related dialogue, as we will do tonight. Second, our conversations, dialogues, and discussions must be academically grounded and informed, since we are, after all, an academic institution and a school of education that I would point out is comprised of among the most productive scholars at the University of Redlands. Though many topics and issues are highly charged and controversial, it is our aim to inform through academic expertise and study. This may be tedious to some, but it assures that we are integrating the best of intellectual traditions of reason and thought into our discussions with you, so that we may get beyond singular opinions, dogma, and emotionalism. Some of the goals for tonight include: describe critical race theory to you, including its major tenets. Offer you some thoughts on how critical race theory informs how we think about such topics as race and racism and diversity and inequity, and how these concepts apply to different groups and different populations that we all care about. We also want to provide you information that helps you bridge theory to practice, of course. Many of you in the audience are practitioners, and what does this mean to you and to the practice that you are engaged in on a daily basis? We hope that you will enjoy the discussion tonight, and we invite you to offer your thoughts and your questions in the chat as we proceed with the evening. Thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. Thank you, team, for conducting this session through the Center of Educational Justice.
Thank you, Dean Martinez. And at this point, I would like to call on my colleague, Dr. Larry Gross, to make an announcement.
Miigwech, Jose. I'm going to make a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to be speaking partly in my native tongue of Ojibwe Moan, or the Ojibwe language. Gakina Manidug, all you spirits. Gakina Gidinwe Magani all of our relatives have passed away. And Watpan Indigenikas, my name is Calm Water, and Gizi Indudayam. I'm from the Bald Eagle clan. Gawababi Ganika Gindunba. I come from the White Earth Reservation. Amayayam, Yahavietim, Aki Minoa, Warangayam, Akiate. We are on Kauai land and Suia land. In Gitandamin, we acknowledge this. Nimigotua Nanig, Yahavietam, Aniku Bijinaganag, Minoa, Warangayam, Aniku Bijiganab. We thank the ancestors of the Kauai and the ancestors of the Serrano. Nimi gochiwa nanig nungum yuhavietam Anishinabeg minua warangayam Anishinabeg. We thank the Kauai people and the Serrano people of today. And I will say that I am taking personal responsibility to thank the Kauai and Serrano people by engaging in educating the Native American students, Native leaders of tomorrow. And I always like to put in what I'm personally doing to honor the Native people of the land. As far as I'm concerned, if you do not include that personal responsibility that you're taking, your land acknowledgement is simply performative. So that's what I am doing, to take personal responsibility to honor the ancestors of this land. Miigwech, thank you. Jose, you're going to have to unmute yourself. Either that or my computer's not working.
All right. Thank you, Dean Martinez again, and thank you, Larry. And to start our conversation, let me share my slide with you, which is the full slide for this event. Okay. As Dr. Martinez has mentioned very thoughtfully and in fact inspiring, this gathering is a gathering of scholars and practitioners, and we are presenting some materials that are theory and research based. So these are some of the key readings on critical race theory for the audience who are going to be interested in pursuing more study and more reading about the topic. Of course, in written form, we have Bridges, the critical race theory of primary race. She's a lawyer who wrote this book based on a legal perspective. And we have several names that you can see who have written about this topic of critical race theory from legal perspective as well as from the educational perspective. There are also readings not only on CRT, but references on the discussion of race itself. And for those scholars and practitioners who want to pursue more reading, there are all kinds of materials related to race, racism, whiteness, and critical race theory. Let me start this conversation by also bringing up the name Derek Bell, who was the first African-American tenured law professor at Harvard University. He was then became the dean of the University of Oregon Law School and is a professor of law at NYU. He wrote that critical race theory is a body of legal scholarship and put together initially by people of color who are ideologically committed to the struggle against racism particularly as institutionalized in and by law. Those critical race theories involve all kinds of people. And so he wrote that those critical race theories who are white are usually cognizant and committed to the overthrow of their own racial privilege. You hear about storytelling. Critical race theory is really big in using storytelling as a way of presenting legal matters. And I quote here, storytelling represent valued experiences and worldviews. And according to legal scholars, stories may be more compelling or more persuasive than seeing the best statistics or hearing the best doctrinal analysis. According to CRT legal scholars, they assert that certain people of color have deliberately chosen race-conscious orientations and objectives to resolve conflicts of interpretation in acting on the commitment to social justice and anti-subordination. And since then, CRT has expanded not just from the perspective of black-white paradigm, but in other areas of interest as well. Dr. Striperda, are you around now? You want to?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Yeah, do your introduction.
Okay. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here today. We have a wide variety of expertise in the room, and I'm so happy to be able to introduce our wonderful panelists this evening. So first we have Dr. Brian Charest. He is from the University of Redlands. Second, we have Dr. Day, also from the University of Redlands. Then we have Dr. Magzi. She is from the University of Redlands. Dr. Greg Hamilton will also be speaking tonight from the University of Redlands. Dr. Larry Gross is from the University of Redlands, but also works very closely with Cal State San Bernardino, right? Hello. And then we have Dr. April Clay. Thank you, I can barely see that. From Clay Counseling Solutions, who works closely with San Bernardino County. We have Dr. Ayana Lackman, who is a principal and also is an educational consultant. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Joanna Dorado, who is a school board member for Alvord USD. Then we have Dr. Angela Luke, who is from Cal State San Bernardino. Dr. Margaret Solomon, who is from La Sierra University, also used to be a professor here at the University of Redlands. We have Dr. Kitty Fortner, who is from California State University, Dominguez Hills. And we have Bill Hendrick, who is a school board member from Riverside Community College District. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists for being here today. Tonight's webinar will feature all of our scholar practitioners who I just introduced, who have done research and engaged in best practices using critical race theory as a lens for addressing different inequalities and inequities in our society and educational system. It will also cover the experiences of white and Black students, in addition to the challenges faced by LatinX students, specifically using the lens of LatInCrit, or Asian students using AsianCrit, Indigenous students or Indigenous peoples in education, and using TribalCrit, and students with disabilities, and going through the lens of DisCrit. So you can see that we are going to be talking about critical race theory as a lens, but then more specific to the actual races and cultures of different people and their experiences.
Okay. Yeah, critical race theory lens. As I've said, the white and Black paradigm of CRT expands into all kinds of areas. And so for tonight, you will hear from scholars and practitioners about critical race theory as it applies to different areas of interest. We're going to cover the TribalCrit, AsianCrit, DisabilityCrit, and AsianCrit, and of course, the black-white paradigm as well. So at this moment, I would like to yield the floor to Dr. Brian Chares.
Well, thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. Super excited to be here with my fellow panelists. I'm just trying to get my mouse to work here, so bear with me. There we go. So good evening, everybody. I want to start tonight first by thanking my colleagues, Jose Lawless and Heidi Strickwerda and Dean Martinez at Center for Educational Justice for organizing and sponsoring this really important event. My goal this evening is really just to outline for you the larger political context for what I think might be most accurately described as a coordinated attack on teachers, on truth, and on free speech. I'm going to be drawing tonight on a recently published brief about the attacks on teachers that was signed by more than 130 educational organizations. And the brief was developed collectively by a group of education scholars, and the lead author was Dr. Kevin Kumashiro. He's a former dean at the University of San Francisco, and I will drop a link to the brief in the chat if you wish to read further in this area. So I'll be focusing this evening on 4 key areas of the brief. Number one, I'll share some talking points for educators to think about as we reframe this debate. Secondly, I'll just briefly address what is being attacked and by whom. Third, I'll talk about why these attacks are happening now. And fourth, I'll discuss how we can build power to create a stronger movement for educational justice. Of course, these attacks have been framed in the media as a debate about something called critical race theory. But the CRT that's been attacked in the media and at your local school board meeting is really not anything that scholars, and we'll hear more about this in a few minutes from our exciting lineup of experts tonight. So that CRT that's being attacked doesn't really resemble anything that scholars would recognize as the critical race theory that emerged from the work of legal scholars of color in the 1970s. Dr. Lawless, Dr. Strickwerda just referenced. This CRT was developed by a group of scholars who wanted to understand why civil rights legislation and litigation that purported to eradicate racism in our society did not achieve its goals, and why racial inequities seem to persist despite these legislative efforts. So, in other words, following the civil rights movement, people of color have still experienced ongoing racial discrimination, and these scholars set out to understand why and how that was happening. So that's about as much of the history of CRT you're going to get from me tonight, because my colleagues here are going to do a much better job of explaining CRT and what it is and how it works. So why am I here tonight? I'm really here to help put the current hysteria around CRT into context for you. To begin, I want to note that by last count, 27 state legislatures and 165 national and local organizations have made efforts to restrict education on racism, largely focused on what's been misidentified as CRT. As a result, school board members have been ousted. Some educators have resigned over death threats or social media bullying or other types of harassment that they've received from those who are confused about CRT and convinced that teaching a more inclusive and we might argue more truthful history somehow harms our students. So much of the hoopla around CRT in schools has been based on the false assertion that talking about race and racism produces racism or racial divisions. Of course, this is like saying that teaching about Nazism and the Holocaust will turn our students into Nazis. This idea that teaching about race makes students racist or makes them feel badly about themselves also contradicts several recent research studies that show that teaching ethnic studies or teaching about systemic racism actually improves cross-cultural understandings for students from all racial groups. So let me share 4 talking points with you all to help us better frame this debate that's happening. Number 1, teaching in a democratic society means teaching the truth. A fundamental task of education in a democratic society is to teach the truth with all its complexities. Advancing democracy and justice requires illuminating, addressing, and healing from inequities and injustices, not only at the interpersonal level, but also as they manifest institutionally, intersectionally, and pervasively. Number two, teaching the truth requires teaching the contradictions. When people look honestly at the history of the United States, they will see many contradictions and tensions, including long legacies of injustice alongside long struggles for justice, and competing ways of interpreting these histories. Number three, teaching the contradictions requires teaching through discomfort. Teaching and learning in ways that advance democracy and justice is not easy. Doing so involves asking challenging questions, questioning conventional wisdom, examining different perspectives, and thinking critically. Such processes can lead to feelings of discomfort. Number four, teaching and learning requires seeing the bigger picture. The current attacks on teaching strategically misrepresent scholarship in order to demonize educators and rally voters. So what is being attacked and by whom? I don't have a lot of time to get into this. I did have a slide that recognizes there are a set of organizations that are currently supporting GOP lawmakers to try to shape education policy and silence educators. And there's more about this in the brief if you want to take a look. So why are these attacks happening right now? First, the overall goal here is to mobilize a base of the political right to win federal, state, and local majorities in 21 and 22. Second, the goal is to weaken teacher unions. Teachers are under attack and unions offer teachers protections to teach the truth in their classrooms. Third, this is about framing the narrative in order to deflect from systemic analysis of racism and inequities in society. And fourth, this is really a branding strategy for groups attacking CRT. Specifically, Christopher Rufo, whose CRT briefing book uses a thorough and willful misrepresentation of CRT to build political support and silence teachers who teach about systemic injustice. So my last section tonight is how can we build a stronger movement for justice in education? Well, first of all, we need to work together. Know that you're not alone. Over 100 national professional associations and organizations, including many of the leading national education organizations in this country, released a statement opposing these attacks on educators, and some of their websites have additional resources and ways that we can work together. Know your rights. So for educators under attack or in need of support, don't forget your rights and the resources available to you through your unions and other professional associations. And then join collective actions. Many of the organizations that endorsed the background brief, including two organizations that I'm a member of, the Inland Empire Educators for Social Justice here in the IE and Care Ed, are right here in California, and they're developing resources and organizing initiatives to bring together and support educators and leaders in acting collectively on justice issues. So as an educator myself, interested in the future of public education in this country, for me, this debate really comes down to the idea of what it means to teach in a free and open democracy. Are we free to ask difficult questions and teach in ways that may be discomforting? Can we challenge our students to look carefully and critically at whose story gets told and why other stories or perspectives are being left out or marginalized? This is ultimately about the freedom to ask questions. I don't know about you, but I want my kids to live in a society where they can continue to question the world around them, even if those questions are critical of their own society or government. In closing, if we can't acknowledge the truth, then we can't reconcile or repair. That's the great irony here. We have this incredible opportunity to reconcile and repair if we could only look honestly at how we got to where we are today. That doesn't mean we can't celebrate the progress we've made as a society. It just means that we need to stay open to examining the truth in all its complexities and contradictions. I believe students should be exploring a wide range of ideas and perspectives in our classrooms in order to better understand the truth about this country and how to make it better for everyone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Dr. Charest. And Dr. Greg Hamilton.
Dr. Hamilton, you're muted.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. It's great to be here, and thank you all for putting this together. And visiting and being part of the conversation. The image that I am going to show here is the byline, and the byline of the story appearing on my Twitter feed this afternoon reads, "A United States Border Patrol agent on horseback tries to stop a Haitian migrant from entering an encampment on the banks of the Rio Grande near the Cuna del Rio International Bridge in Del Rio, Texas." Tensions are very high right now along the US-Mexican border. There's around 12,000 migrants, many of them Haitians. They've set up makeshift refugee camps, and they're trying to flee their home country, which is in a disintegrating political situation. And on Sunday, the US began flying migrants out of the camps on flights back to the Haitian capital, where the country's been, as most of you know, reeling after a massive earthquake and the death of their president. And I just wanted, I'm going to be talking about the history of critical legal studies and critical race theory. And just as a backdrop, we'll change that. It just reminds me how far we have not come. And I almost feel like coming from Oklahoma, this could have been, you know, a scene 50 years ago as well as it is today. But I'm here to talk a brief history, so I'll be brief. Let me just preface this reading to note that I'll be using the term critical race theory, but I believe critical race theory not so much to be a theory, but a social movement we'll be discussing here this evening. So the historical roots of critical race theory gives us a clear picture of how society worked in the past and how it has come to work the way it is now. The story of these roots provides us with data used to create laws and theories about our society, how countries, families, and groups are formed, and it helps us to understand contemporary issues in relation to CRT, pushing us to ask and respond to questions like this I had to when I saw that image: why are things the way they are? As historian Malik Simba noted in Critical Race Theory, A Brief History, the intellectual roots of critical race theory may be traced to the ideas of the legal realism scholars of the late 19th and 20th centuries. Simba recognizes the work of Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote the Common Book of Law in 1881. According to Holmes, the life of the law has not been logic, but experience, the felt necessities of the time, the prevalent moral and political theories, institutions of public policy, avowed or unconscious, even the prejudices which judges share with their fellow human beings have a good deal more to do with determining the rules by which human beings should be governed. Simba also recognizes the work of two additional court justices, Charles Evan Hughes and Benjamin Cardozo. In 1907, Hughes challenged the impartiality of the US Constitution, writing, "The Constitution is what the judges say it is." And in 1920, Justice Benjamin Cardozo wrote that the legal profession should recognize and understand sociological jurisprudence and the impact of societal norms on the law. The passage of progressive era social legislation during the 20s, 30s, and 40s represented a growing consensus that legal realism rejected the earlier liberal concept that Our Lady Justice is blind to race. The legal scholar Carl Llewellyn of Yale and Columbia Law Schools in 1930 published A Realist Jurisprudence, the First Step. The influence of legal realism unsettled American jurisprudence for decades. Alan Hunt writes that the period between the realism of the 1930s and the emergence of critical legal studies in the late 1970s has been a series of unsuccessful attempts to recover from the shock of legal realism, which articulates an image of the objectivity of the legal process. Critical legal theory and critical race theory appeared simultaneously in the 1970s. During this time, Derek Bell and Alan Freeman, both at the University of Buffalo Law School, published Serving Two Masters, Integration of Ideals and Client Interests in School Desegregation Litigation. That was Bell 76. And Legitimizing Racial Discrimination Through Anti-Discrimination Law, a Critical Review of Supreme Court Doctrine. That was Freeman 78. Freeman challenged the colorblind theory and its premise of racial neutrality, acknowledging that While it's never been the law, the Supreme Court was in fact upholding the use of racial classifications. During the 1970s, racism was often based, as most of us know, on beliefs about biological inferiority and that certain minority groups were deficient, thus explaining their unequal access to opportunities like good jobs and schools. In the 1980s, A.Y. Martinez and her work, Critical Race Theory, Its Origins, History, and Importance to the Discourses and Rhetoric of Race, cited two major historical events leading to the development of critical race theory. The first, in 1981, involved student protests, boycotts, and the organization of an alternative course on race and law at Harvard Law School. And you've seen him mentioned earlier, at that time, Harvard Law professor Derek Bell, author of Race and Racism and American Law, challenged the traditional liberal approach to racism and is cited by CRT scholars as being central to the development of the movement. And the second event was the 1989 National Conference called New Developments in Critical Race Theory. Organizers of the conference were Kimberly Crenshaw, mentioned earlier, and known for her work on intersectionality, and Mari Matsude, who referred to the conference as marking the genesis of an intellectually distinctive and critical account of race on terms set forth by race-conscious scholars of color. And it was during this time that the project of critical race theory became the effort to deconstruct the construction of law and race. During the late 1980s, Richard Delgado, professor of law at the University of Colorado, and Derek Bell published And We Are Not Saved, The Elusive Quest for Racial Justice, 1987. While critical race theorists are known for examining the law, they were also the first legal scholars to promote the idea of intersectionality, literally going beyond the black-white paradigm to examine the range of oppressions affecting a variety of racial, ethnic, and gender groups who ironically form the majority of the US population. And in conclusion, a little long conclusion though, during the 1990s, it was Lani Guinier who held tenured professorships of law at both Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania, worked to expand voting rights and diversify students and faculty within colleges and universities. Her Republican opponents attacked her publications and accused her of embracing critical race theory. From that point on, critical race theory became a battleground. And in conclusion, Simba in his article, Critical Race Theory, A Brief History, writes, critical race theory has had a strange intellectual history which has meandered through numerous legal minds as well as within social movements. This intelligentsia of these movements have attempted to use critical race theory to indict law as the legitimizing cultural social structure, which cements the social conditions and social relations of oppression. The question of whether they will succeed in persuading the larger legal community or the larger American society that their interpretation is correct is now a matter of intense ongoing debate. And here we go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hamilton. Let's see here.
It is me.
That's Dr. April Clay. Welcome, Dr. April Clay. Your turn now.
Awesome. Thank you.
Talk about it.
All right, let's talk about it. Woo, critical race theory. You told me I got 5 minutes. I don't know, but I'm gonna try my best to stay to 5 to 7. I want you all to know first that critical race theory is, I love that you said it's a movement. Created advocacy tool so that we might have our stories told in a way that allows who don't already know, African Americans, Black folks, since our entrance into, well, actually prior to our was among us, period. Black folks weren't taught to think. We already came thinking. They didn't go take people from Africa that had to be taught to read. They took the scholars They took the mathematicians. They took some of the greatest scientists and brought them over here and abused and put them in fields, etc. And out of the dust we rise. And I think it's important that I acknowledge and start there. And I don't want to do anything that might reduce this narrative, because it is the most important thing that we can do is honor each other's stories. So it doesn't take away. When I say Black Lives Matter, that means April Marie Clay's life matters. You may not murder me in the street like it's 1950, 1920, 1819. You feel me? It is about advocating for our livelihood. And so what's become very interesting for me is witnessing the political, I'm gonna call it the creating a political space around critical race theory in order to put it in a box, and I'm going to call it a Trojan horse. You put critical race theory in a box, and now you could say that everything associated with a counter narrative is now dangerous and going to hurt your children. And then in one fatal swoop, we get rid of any opportunity for folks to share their story. Critical race theory was never intended to be a kindergarten lesson, ever. So how did I get introduced to the topic? I think I should start there, and then I'll give you a little bit about the theoretical framework itself. So critical race, when I had to choose a doctoral dissertation, right, I had to pick dissertation, who's going to be my dissertation chair, Dr. Jose Lales. I think probably all of our hands were up, and then, you know, some of us didn't get to have him as our chair, but we fought over having Dr. Lales as our chair. He introduced me to microaggressions. When he introduced me to microaggressions, I met a presenter who I stood in front of the board and tears poured down my chocolate cheeks as I read my experience. Microaggression was not a word you could Google back in 2007. It wasn't. In 2007, when we started the program, that was not a word you could Google. Now in 2021, after the death of a human being, George Floyd, and after a warm summer of advocacy, we might be able to Google microaggressions. But all throughout the time I was writing that dissertation, it was error, 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 error. That was not a word that you could commonly use. So critical race theory is one of those frameworks that allows microaggressions to exist, because microaggressions, though presented in the 1970s by a Black psychologist, got very little traction because the world didn't really want to talk about it. So William Tate and Gloria Ladson-Billings presented for the first time critical race theory to the field of education in 1994 at the American Education Research Association. When they did that, that was groundbreaking. If you haven't read the article, you don't know the story. I recommend you read Towards the Theory of Education. I'm not really sure of the title. It's been a long time since I did the dissertation, but read that article. It's when they originally brought it up in AERA, okay? Second, I think it's important for you to know that critical race theory has 5 primary tenets. And can I give it to you in 2 minutes? No. But I can tell you what they are. You can go and do some research if you truly feel that this is something of interest to you. I hope and pray that you do, because your kids, your grandkids, my grandkids depend on our ability to communicate and advocate for one another. So critical race theory's 5 primary tenets include counter storytelling. I kind of feel like we could start and stop there, but you need the others in order to actually have the story told. Counter storytelling, I'll go back to in just 1 second, because that to me is the creme de la creme. That's the thing that we need to be able to do, tell our stories. But it leans on these other 4 tenets to be able to tell our stories. One is that the permanence of racism. Racism is not new and is not going anywhere. If you haven't read the article 1776, published by United States American government, published by our past president, Donald Trump, you missed out on the opportunity to learn what Americans are divided over. So read 1776. It's a publication from the White House. That tells you kind of how we got to where we are right now in the warm summer of 2021. Things have not changed. So knowing that permanence of racism is important, understanding that the permanence of racism includes our ability to navigate these conversations around race, talking about racist, all that extra stuff that happens. It's truly a fallacy, and it's intended to reduce the topic and discussion, to shut it down essentially. It's endemic in American life. It's ingrained in every aspect of our being, including our legal approach, our culture, even psychology, what's taught in our education, higher education, etc. Whiteness as a property is the second, it's really the third tenet. But whiteness as a property means it cannot be bought, it cannot be sold, it can only be passed down through your inheritance. What does that mean? Oprah Winfrey can buy a house, she can buy a mansion, she could buy a whole island, but she can never get whiteness. So you want to go deeper, I recommend doing some reading of your own. The next thing I think it's important for you to know that this whole idea of counter storytelling means that there's an entrance convergence. So entrance convergence, you could argue, would be including this idea that we have multiple areas that we're all possibly exposed to microaggressions. So you could be experiencing racism, sexism, you could be experiencing all sorts of different types of isms, but this entrance convergence means that we're talking about across studies, we're talking about across continents. This is something that we need to be really thinking about across the globe. It's not just one of us, it's all of us that are impacted. Go to Nigeria, walk down the aisles and look at the beauty products and how they're selling people this beauty product that would change the color of their skin to white. And then the last I would want to point out would be the critique of liberalism. This notion that you could possibly pull yourself up by the bootstraps that you don't even own. How can you do that when your family for generations has been oppressed and equity has been dispensed only to those who look like, you know, the folks in charge? I think it's important that you take time to actually read these tenets yourselves, because I can't capture them quick enough for you. I also want to give you two other names that you ought to know about. So we talked about William Tate and Gloria Ladson-Billings. Ladson-Billings actually came and graced the floors of the University of Redlands. Dr. Lawless, we got a chance to enjoy her company. Tyrone Howard, another amazing scholar out of UCLA, came and graced our company. It was just amazing to be able to hear these people up close and personal. How did we get them? Great question. So glad you asked. Because Dr. April Clay and Dr. Ayana Balagan, students enrolled, we were over at AERA asking a lot of questions, and we learned about a second approach to learning at the AERA conferences. And we opened the doors to all these different folks and sat down at the table with them. And it was just, Dr. Tyrone Howard, can you help me? It was so-and-so, can you help me? I stood with Adrian Dixon. So when I'm talking to Dr. Lawless about my dissertation, I'm saying, I quoted her. Here's what she said. I read it to him. And he's like, okay, well, write that down. How do I cite somebody in person? I don't know. I'm going to figure it out. This is how we create a narrative. We have to go and find those Black scholars. If you have Black people in your presence and you're advocating for them, give them the mic. Let them go out and speak on their own, one. Number two, let them find Black theorists that they can advocate, they can use to tell their story. You can't let their story be told by somebody else. They have to tell their own story. This idea of counter narrative starts the real conversation around advocacy. If I can't tell you who I am and what I experience, that means that the value of my existence is decreased and diminished, and I really have no value here. I mean, so much more I can share with you. I just love, and thank the university for creating this space. Dr. Lawless, we always love and appreciate you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Clay. And you know, Dr. Clay, just for transparency, introduced me to this concept, inspired me to read and learn more about it. And we co-wrote a paper and presented it at AERA. Remember that? That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Clay. All right, Dr. Ayana Balagan.
Wow. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't even know how to follow up to that. I'm looking at myself like, oh my gosh. Just thanks for being here. Thank you all for listening in to what we have to say. And thank you, Dr. Lawless, for always being the champion, even though sometimes you're in the front line alone. We appreciate the work that you're doing here and at the school board of Corona Norco. Dr. Cherez, thank you so much for presenting just your passion of this issue. And I know you could talk lots and lots about it. Dr. Hamilton, I agree with April when she said this is a social movement. We appreciate that. And I also appreciate Dr. Gross when he talked about giving land rights or opening up. I want to do something that we as Black people do is we give libations. Libations is a dedication or remembrance to the people, and we give shout outs. Uncle Dr. Lawless, Auntie Dr. Luke, those are people we've adopted into our family. Sister Dr. April Clay, definitely shout out to my mom, my husband Amole One, Shanti Genesis, Aking, my grandma Daisy, my Uncle Benny, the BPA, and of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to my Warner Stars, because that's what we do when you invite us to the space and we tell our own narratives. Now, on for the business. I don't even know where to start because we've had such amazing people speaking for us. So I'm going to jump into where my lane is and how I deal with critical race theory on a daily basis. And Dr. April Clay is right. We were at AURA just soaking up so much knowledge, and it was a privilege to be able to do that. So let's get started. Let's jump right in. I was going to give homage to Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, Gloria Latson-Billings, but you guys have already done that. So I just want to reiterate, these are current professors that are fighting this fight and out in the public from Columbia Law, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, Dr. Kendall Thomas, as well as Patricia Williams. And it's making headline news. And we know this, but that's not the real story. Let me jump right in. Next slide, please. As a part of my own research, as we mentioned, I used critical race theory as a lens. Now, we all know that we don't use lenses in elementary school, but when I was getting my doctorate degree, I used it as a lens to understand why African-American students are having such disparaging data when other folks are thriving. So I started to figure out what are ways that they're dealing with this racial battle fatigue in a system where they're pushed out and they don't belong. And so I started to talk to Black students and focus groups and things of that nature, and discovered that they use writing as a refuge. We often talk about African-American and their achievement in literacy, but we often leave out the writing piece, which is the most important piece because it's their ability to tell their narrative. And what I found out was that this place for them to tell their narrative was a refuge for them. Not only was it a tool for them to find peace and become whole again because of all the harm that was done to them, it was also a way that they used or exclaimed or expressed themselves for personal task and communication, but mostly for a way of expression, their creative thought, for them to maintain their authentic voices, for them to be who they were and to preserve their racial identity. Next slide. And when it comes in terms of critical race theory, we want to think about, quite simply, according to Kimberly Crenshaw, this is a way to openly talk about America's history and how it had an effect on our institutions and our policies. She says we need to pay attention to what has happened in our country and what is continuing to happen. But I won't belabor this point because our scholars before me have already said that. Jump to the next slide. A lot of this slide we can move over. It tells the story of institutional racial disadvantage and systemic racial inequality. And Thomas, one of the scholars, says that the people behind this legislation is trying to prevent the emergence of a broad movement of a multiracial democracy to address interconnected economic, social, political inequality that is devastating poor and working class communities of all races in this country. Quite simply, it is the oldest trick in the book, as Dr. Clay mentioned, to divide us. And it is also a way to keep us divided. If we're constantly talking about or deflecting, which I think is a tenet of racism in itself, deflection and distraction, so you can't deal with the real issue. If we want to talk about what is really happening, I need you to take a look at these next two slides. As a result of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and I lift up their names because we will remember them, this is a map of how many protests across the globe happened as a result of that racial uprising. A very powerful image for us to see that we're starting to, everyone was at home on the pandemic and they saw 9 minutes of torture. And so it caused lots of anxiety, and it shined a light on what's been happening in America for a long time. Next slide. People in Europe, Japan, Germany were all protesting about what we need to do, and Black lives do matter. Black lives do matter, and our policies and practices have ignored not just Black lives, but lives of all oppressed people. But in this particular lens, when we're talking about critical race theory, it's about Blackness and anti-Blackness. Next slide. So you see, it wasn't just about critical race theory, the theory in itself. It was about how we globally can come together to end systemic racism and what power we have if we band together, and what we need to do as humanity to really bring to an end what has happened for years, which is shed light on our history. And we know it's not just in education or legal studies, it's in health disparities. It's in housing. It's in so many other avenues or so many systems where discrimination is a part of our regular everyday practices. So how do we get here when it comes to public education? And that's the world that I kind of hang out in. And so let's go to the next slide. There were some questions Dr. Alalis asked me. He said, and I said, okay, how can I answer these without being a smarty pants? Do we teach critical race theory in public education? Hell no. No. How would you explain that we don't? Well, it's such a complex theory. It isn't being taught to students. And I think Dr. Charest brought that up. It's a theory with a lens that we haven't been using in public education at all. The first time I understood theory and looking at a theoretical lens was in college. And so it's not definitely something we don't teach to 5 and 6 year olds. They're barely learning how to tie their shoes. When it comes to critical race theory and why we need it in public education is because we want to understand the systems. And more importantly, we want to talk about the disproportionality that we see in schools with systems that have existed for so long, but no one's ever questioned them. When we think of critical race theory, we have to say, has race played a part? And have we paid attention to the narratives that count? Why are African Americans, even though they're one of the lowest populations in schools, why do they have the highest suspension rates and expulsions? Why do they have low referrals to honors, AP, and GATE classes? Why do they have higher referrals to special education? Why is the current curriculum and instruction taught from a deficit lens of what they don't have instead of from a culturally responsive lens of what they do have? One of the things that we also need to pay attention to are our local accountability, local control accountability plans. These are the plans that are supposed to address the issues or the gaps in learning with our most in need students. Why aren't Black folks at the table? Why aren't they contributing? Why don't we see, we did some race research a few years ago of Dr. Luke and Dr. Clay and Dr. Will Greer about this. Why aren't they even named in the LCAP? If we know that this is an issue and we have to place resources for the most vulnerable groups, why aren't they named in our LCAP plans? Next slide. What can we do? I know that we talked about critical race theory being an old trick in the book. It's a deflection. It is really to counter and distract us from this racial and moral uprising, but more importantly, our democracy. And our democracy is at stake. And so what are we supposed to be teaching? Next slide, please. What are we supposed to be teaching? We're supposed to be teaching an inclusive history that tells the truth with no omission to the ugly past and the structures and the policies that promote anti-Blackness. We're supposed to be teaching those things. So when we look at the work of Bettina Love and abolitionist teaching, when we look at the work of Kendi Ibram and how to be anti-racism, neutrality is not an option. You know, we can't be neutral in this fight. You're either racist and you're supporting the policies, or you're anti-racist, or you're a co-conspirator. and which is that's another book that you might want to read. We Want to Do More Than Survive, which is a book by Bettina Love, and it talks about liberation pedagogy. So finally, I want to just close this out and what you guys already know. This is not about CRT. It's not about teaching white kids that they did something wrong. They weren't even born. Their parents weren't even born. This is not about that. It's about structures and policies and how critical race theory sheds a light on that, and how we as anti-Black folks must promote a policy that is about equity. And so parents, what can you do? Show up at these school board meetings. Show up at become a school site council meeting. Become a school site council rep. Join the PTA. There's lots of school districts that are beginning to have African American parent advisory committees. Join those. Actively engage in opportunities where the curriculum is approved. And it can't be a curriculum that's neutral. It has to be a curriculum that is inclusive of everybody's voices. And then finally, ask the kind of questions that are important. And some of those questions are, who was at the table when the agenda was written about equity? Because we have a lot of folks using the word equity as a buzzword right now. We know that they're not really about equity work. Even when it comes to universities, I can't forget about the universities as a part of the educational system. Are there African American folks at the table teaching? Why did we only have Dr. Lawless to go to when we were writing our dissertation? Are we retaining African American teachers in public and in college institutions? What are we doing to recruit them? What are we doing to support them? And where are these meetings happening? And how is the information being carried out? Are all voices heard? So these are some of the questions that you need to be asking yourself as we embark upon this fight. We all have racial battle fatigue when it comes to constantly explaining that it's about policy, practice, and procedures, right? But we can't give up, and we must come together in solidarity because we have to fight for our democracy. At the very least, CRT is about creating hope that our democracy works. And so with that, I'm done.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Balaga. And as usual, wonderful words of wisdom from you, from a principal, from a scholar practitioner in explaining the influence of race in schooling, in training K-12, as well as in higher ed. Thank you, Dr. Balagan. Now we would like to hear from Dr. Angela Clark-Luke from Cal State, San Bernardino. Angela, take it on.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. You can go on and start with the next slide. But thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Angela Clark-Luke. I'm a professor at Cal State San Bernardino, and I groom educators for leadership roles, principals, deans, administrators, directors, superintendents, presidents, so on and so forth. So since I was asked to cover the part about teacher and leadership preparation programs, I'm going to invite you to my class. So just pretend for a few minutes that you are in my leadership class. So welcome to Leadership 2021. I'm going to go over the syllabus with you. You're going to have a grand time here for this semester. Sometimes you're going to be comfortable and sometimes you're not going to be comfortable. So let's just start off with just the basics about leadership. What do leaders do? And what are the characteristics of a leader? So let's think about this historically. And let's think about what you've learned in school in your K-12 learning, just about, people in general. So let's go back all the way to one of the first leaders of the United States. Let's talk about George Washington, first president of the United States, right? What did you know about George Washington? Did you hear about something about a tree? Did you learn something about a cherry tree, that he chopped down a cherry tree? All right, or apple tree or some kind of tree. Did you learn anything about, he never told a lie? Okay, yeah, because I was taught that, which is a lie within itself, but that's okay. All right, so did you learn anything about that he was an owner of enslaved people? That's the key. Were you taught that? All right, so what do you say, what does that say about somebody's character when we think about leaders and we talk about characters? All right, so he enslaved people and owned them in that sense, but he was considered a leader. All right, so let's go on because we got to keep it moving through the syllabus. Let's think about somebody named Hitler. Remember that guy? Remember he had issues with Jews, right? Germans, Jews, remember that whole, okay, all right. But do you know that he was not born in Germany? Okay, he wasn't born in Germany. All right, but he believed and was very successful with propaganda. Some people would even call him with somebody with charisma. He believed in the psychology of lying. The longer you lie and the stronger you lie, the more people will believe it. Have we heard that in recent history? About people lying? Okay. So did you know, though, that some of the tactics that he used, that he learned from his spies and from his contacts and from his communications with southern states in the United States, he didn't just get to do all of that by himself. He learned from how Blacks and others were treated in southern states during the Jim Crow time and before. All right. So you can go to slide 2 if you have my slide 2. I don't know who's that. Okay. All right. All right. So the Declaration of Independence. So we've thought about leaders. Let's think about decision makers. Decision makers, so far as we have the Declaration of Independence, those authors. So again, we have the authors who wanted to be free from England. They wrote the Declaration of Independence, and then they decided to continue to have enslaved people. So it seems kind of ironic and maybe even a bit of hypocrisy to want to be free, but you don't want anybody else to be free. All right. All right, but we consider those as leaders too. And just think about some of the things when we think about impacting, because leaders make decisions and decisions have impacts. When you think about enslaved people who were dressed up, supposedly beautiful, smiling in portraits, they were excited to because they knew that they were getting ready to have their baby sold away from them. So sometimes the historical perspectives that we have are impounded and just continue to be entrenched with lies because people just continue to do it over and over again. So when we think about and have, you can go to the next slide. When we think about, and for this class, the importance of critical race theory, let's think about the students of color and teacher and leadership programs. Yes, that number has increased, but here's the deal. That number can increase, but what is going on outside in the field? Are they getting hired as principals? Are they being hired as leaders of schools? Are they being hired in leadership positions throughout the community colleges and even in higher education? We need to find out what is going on between that relationship between students of color coming into our programs, what's going on in our programs, and then what happens when they leave. It's also important for CRT and educational programs. When we think about the relationship, it's critical to have CRT and education and leadership because it's and I quote from Pusher and Villapond, valuable lens to analyze and interpret administrative policies and procedures in educational administration. Think about the policies that we have in school. Some of the policies that we have in school seem to allow other people to cut children's hair. Remember that situation where kids' hair was being cut, not with their parents' permission, but because, according to some of the school districts and according to some of the boards, that the hair was an intrusion or a distraction to the instructional situation and the instructional culture. We do now have the Crown Act in California. There's a movement for that to be, if you don't know about the Crown Act, is creating a respect for open world and an open world for natural hair. They're trying to have a movement for that across the United States. Zero tolerance is another one, another policy. So that's why it's important for our students in higher education to know about critical race theory, because those kinds of things are embedded into and get into the policies. And then those kinds of things disrupt not just the instructional system, that's what's going on, but the disciplinary actions, the exclusionary practices that go on with our students when they are not in school because of supposedly disciplinary actions, they are missing instruction. And we know that teacher education programs often train mostly white pre-service teachers to expect what is called a right to comfort, because they want people to be comfortable in classes, but that's not going to be the case in here all the time. The last slide, let me just read this to you. We've got to come together on this and kind of figure out what we're going to do to try to continue to move forward. You don't lead, though, by hitting people over the head. That's called assault. That's not leadership, all right? So as have been mentioned earlier, we've got to counter that master narrative, counter the Eurocentric narrative that says a leader can only be white people. It can only be a white male. We've got to counter that. We can't believe that they're the only ones who have the right stuff to make the decisions, to have positive impacts upon our schools and upon our children. Also, the 4 A's, and some of this comes from Ragazzo's work, being an ally, or being an advocate, or being an activist, or even an accomplice. Choose one, but get in the game. Do something, take some action. And then from my book on equity partnerships, the 7 C's of engagement. Think about not just communicating. As a leader, you've got to bring people forward with you. You can't just leave people behind. You've got to lead the charge on this. So it's communicating, it's collaborating, it's building community, and it's also showing care and compassion for people. And then having that connectedness with people as well, and then respecting their culture. But lastly, having that collective responsibility, knowing that we've got to do this together, because yes, there is a sense of oppression and a sense of privilege, but we've got to all move forward because we have the children, we have our society, and we have our communities to think about. So it all needs to work together, and leaders need to take the lead and make sure that we get on our journey. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Look. As you know, when we talk about critical race theory, I think the white and black paradigm frame it in a very inspiring way, that it gets extended to other areas, because racism is not just anti-black or blackness, but it has, racism is also immigration laws, internment camps, stolen land grants, silenced languages, and standardized tests based on standardized cultures. Right. So at this moment, we're gonna call on Dr. Larry Gross, who will talk about racism in a different form.
Thank you, Jose. You don't need to turn the slides on. I'll let you know later when I would like them turned on. So again, my name is Larry Gross. I am the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians Endowed Chair of Native American Studies at the University of Redlands in beautiful Redlands, California. I like to introduce myself that way. I'm going to be talking about tribal critical race theory. So it refers to Native Americans, Indigenous people, however you want to refer to them here in the United States. And I'm just going to, I can sum up everything you need to know about tribal critical race theory in 3 words. Indians are different. What does that mean? In addition to being a racialized group, Native Americans are the only political group in the United States that are also marginalized in that way. Why is that? That is because we are sovereign nations. We have sovereignty. We have treaties with the United States government. We have nation-to-nation relationships with the federal government and state governments. And so as a result of that, one of our largest concerns then is maintaining our sovereignty. In that regard then, the project, or I should say then, that in addition to racism being central to our experience as advocated or taught by critical race theory, we also talk about how colonialism is central to our life. So not only do we have to overcome racism, we have to overcome the political effects of colonialism. And as a result of that, our project is different. Most marginalized groups in the United States have an assimilist project. That is, they want to become full and equal and complete members of American society. For Native Americans, our project is anti-assimilationist. We want to maintain our sovereignty. We want to maintain our distinct identity. And the theory of tribal critical race theory, or TribalCrit, as it's sometimes called, was developed by Brayboy, and I'm going to put a
Slide.
not a slide, but I'm going to, in the chat area, put the bibliographic information for the article that is most often referred to as the origin or the classicus locus for the theory. And then I'm also going to put in the link in the chat a link so that you can download that article yourself.
Thanks.
Within the article, Brayboy talks about 9 tenets of tribal critical race theory, and I will put those in the chat area as well so you can see what they are. As you can see, it talks about the importance of colonialism, sovereignty, and etc. So if you want to follow up on that, you can read Brayboy's article, and it's been cited, I think, well over 1,300 times. So happy reading. What I want to do now is just talk a little bit about why tribal critical race theory is important. It's important for Native people, and I would argue that it's important for non-Native people as well. What we're trying to do is, be able to express their sovereignty to as great a degree possible. Study after study has shown that when Native Americans are able to exercise their sovereignty, the results are good for Native people. So you see this in education, you see this in economic development, you see that in health outcomes as well. So sovereignty is important for Native American people. It's just the right thing to do. But I'm going to be blunt here, and I'm also going to say, for non-Indian people, if you want to survive, you need strong Indian nations within your midst. And I'm going to provide 2 reasons why that's so. One is, they talk about how the states in the United States are laboratories for democracy. There are over 500 Native American nations in the United States, and that's not even including the whole of the entire hemisphere, Western Hemisphere. So can you imagine what could happen if we had 500 plus fully functioning laboratories for democracy? How much that would benefit us? Talk about a convergence of interests. But there's another reason as well. What I like to say is, if you want to survive, you need to, let me put it this way. Throughout American history, mainstream Americans have turned to Native Americans for survival, and that's a fact. And so what I'm going to talk about here is, why don't you go ahead and put up the first slide there, please. We were just talking about the Declaration of Independence, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with this picture here. So what I'm going to talk about here is and tell you what's wrong with this picture. Well, again, I'll just say it this way. The fact of the matter is that the United States basically stole its constitution from the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people. And that's not me saying that. That's Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin used to like to make that joke. Oh, we stole our constitution from the Iroquois. But it's also not me saying that. It's the United States Congress. And I put a link in here in the chat area. In 1988, Congress passed a resolution, House Concurrent Resolution 331, acknowledging the contribution of the Iroquois people to the development of the U.S. Constitution. So our democracy is basically founded on the Iroquois Constitution. So what's wrong with this picture? If you could go to the next slide, please. this is the way it really was. This is a scene from the Independence Hall during the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. There are Native American people there. There are Haudenosaunee people there, Iroquois people. And they're there because the founding fathers wanted them there. And if you look closely at this picture on the left, you'll see, to go back please, you'll see that there are Native American women there. So Native American women were present at both the Declaration of Independence Conference and at the framing of the US Constitution. How different would our story be if that was acknowledged? So the history teachers out there, what I'm going to suggest is that you start with Congressional Resolution 331 and ask that question. Why was it that Congress acknowledged the contributions of the Iroquois to the US Constitution? And then also, if we continue on through history, I hope you realize, especially if you're a feminist, that the early feminists and suffragists were inspired again by the Haudenosaunee, because the Haudenosaunee was, in essence, a matriarchy. The women were in charge. There's a reason that those women were there. They weren't speaking. The white guys thought that was wonderful because those Indian women knew their place. They were there because they were the generals, surveying the scene, taking the whole picture in. And they had a few things to say to the men that they appointed as spokespeople later. As I put a little, another bibliographic reference there in the chat area, Sally Roach Wagner has written about this. There's an article that she wrote, it has a link to it, but she also wrote a book, and I'll put that in the chat area as well. Also then I'll say, during World War I and World War II, of course, we had the code talkers. They weren't just Navajo. But I'd like to say, if you had any ancestors serving in the Pacific during World War II, you might be alive today because of the Navajo people. Moving forward in the 1970s, Native Americans offered inspiration for the environmental movement. And then finally, we get to the present day. Well, what do Indians have to offer us today? Well, I look at my own work. Here's an article I wrote on assisting American Indian veterans. And I'll put a link so that you can download that article yourself. But at the end of that article, I talk about ways that the ideas in my article can be used to help non-Indian veterans. One thing I talk about is encouraging church groups to develop ceremonies. So if there are any individuals in our audience today who would like to do that type of work, I'm going to put my email in the chat as well. Feel free to email me and we'll see what we can do. I found the biggest obstacle so far to this work is church bureaucracy, believe it or not. But I also have some ideas to help non-Indian veterans psychologically as well. So if there are any psychologists in the audience who would like to work with me on that, I would invite you to contact me. And so what I would like to do then is this, I'll just say this. My name in Ojibwe is Anwatan, calm water. I was given that name to, because my task is to help calm the troubled hearts of our veterans. And so what I want to do then is end by honoring our veterans. Recently, we lost a good friend of ours who was a Vietnam combat veteran, Gary Lemos. So I want to acknowledge him and his passing. As I said, he was a good friend to us in the Inland Empire Native American community. I want to honor my spiritual mentor, Greg Kingbird Sr. Gimiwan was his Indian name. And I want to honor my Uncle Leo, who was killed in Vietnam and earned the Navy Cross, the second highest Medal of Honor that you can receive. And so I'm going to end by saying, when I say bun at the end, that means the late. Gary Lemesiban, and Nia Weniban, Leo Injisheban, Ni Gochiwananege, we thank you. Kakina Nungum, Bimanaziwad, Ogichidub Miigwech. And we thank the veterans who are still with us today. Ahau, Misa, that's it, Misa. Ikidoyan, that's all I'm going to say. Biziniyayak Miigwech. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Larry Gross. As you know, in a discussion like this, we don't have really enough time to cover everything. This is almost like a survey of the involvement of critical race theory across different sectors of interest. So let me try to plead to the co-presenters to make it short a little bit or make it a little quicker so we can provide the audience and the discussants with more time to ask questions. Okay, so at this moment on LatCrit, you know, the contribution of the LatinX critical theory is that of the notion of it shows the heterogeneity of the Latinx. Some of them are born here, many are immigrants, some speak English, some are learning to speak English as a second language, some are documented, they're DACA, and so on. So they're very diverse. So at this moment, and there's also cultural and language issues that they face. At this moment, I would like to invite Dr. Lynn, who is a principal, and Dr. Joanna Dorado, who is a counselor, to make some comments about it. And I have on the slide, Silvio mentions a Latino family that paved the way for school desegregation in California. Ingrid or Joanna?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Wallace, for inviting me. And I want to echo the sentiment that at University of Redlands, you were the person that we went to, and I know our cohort 7 felt supported by you because we thought you represented our needs and you understood what we were looking for, not the norm, but like Dr. Clay said, you know, microaggressions and a lot of the terminology, the buzzwords that people are using now, we used them before Google had them. So I appreciate that about you. But yes, so I know you gave a little bit about Mendez versus Westminster. They paved the way to desegregation and really understanding what is the correlation between, you know, critical race theory and this event that happened in 1947, which is not that long ago. That's during our time still, and really the marginalization that those students faced that we still see today. You know, having these students, as those of you that are familiar, you know, they were not allowed to attend schools in Orange County that were not particularly for white students, and so it was a family of 4. They were cousins, and the students that looked white physically were able to stay at that school, but the other 2 students, because their skin was darker, were not allowed to attend. So having said that, you know, really what we need to focus on is what impact did that have in our education system, and are we still seeing that? And I know those of you that are in the same field that I am, the answer is yes. Our schools are segregated by income. You know, I work at a Title I school. I used to do that before, but within my district, this one and the previous one, there's affluent communities. So we are still doing that. This is still impacting our families and our students. And our students have this perception that because you look a certain way, just like the Mendez students, because they look dark, they didn't have the intellectual capacity to be in a white school. If you learn more about it, you know, the board and the superintendent felt like they couldn't attend the school with whites because they were too dirty. They were gonna give something to the other students, which as an educator, I've heard things like that. This is my 28th year. So how do we acknowledge, you know, with critical race theory, the purposes, how do we acknowledge that this existed? Because none of us learned this in K-12. We learned it in, you know, I learned it in University of Redlands. But how do we help our elementary students, because I know they're learning how to read, but how do we bring that awareness that we all bring value to what we do within our schools? I know one of the questions is how do you address equity? And I think you can address
critical race theory without telling the kids, appropriate to their age, we can do it through equity. And that's the work that we're doing here. It's like, okay, everybody has value. We all bring something to the table. Let's acknowledge that. Let's acknowledge that we make mistakes, but how do we move forward? So with Latino critical theory, that it's something that I'm gonna let Dr. Joanna go ahead and share her piece. I don't want to take up all the time, but really, as an educator, as a leader in my community, my goal is to help our students understand that racism has existed and that it still does exist in this 21st century. And there are cases that we have had in our history that have tried to change it, but we still continue to have the systemic racism that is implied and indirect within our policies, within our LCAP. And it's our role to make those changes and create that, and break the cycle. I know we talked about it in our classes. How do we break the cycle, right? We don't want vanilla cake. We want all kinds of cakes. And how do we do that within our system? So Joanna, take it away.
Thank you.
Right. Joanna Dorado, another educator who is also a school board member at Alvord Unified School District.
Thank you, Dr. Lawless, and thank you, Dr. Lynn, for introducing the image beautifully and the case that, like you said, even though it's 1945, a lot of our schools, I also work in the K through 12 system. I'm a school board member. Not a lot has changed when we look at segregation by income or neighborhood, where our public school system sits. So what I want to say, it's everybody beautifully said. I feel very engaged by the conversations we've had from all the presenters ahead. But I want to bring it home with the practical, what me and Dr. Lynn see every day in the K through system. I know sometimes that our audience participation is high, and I'm digging everything everybody's saying. Like, it brings me back to the college years, the doctorate, in the classroom lectures, right? It's enriched with all the scholarly work we read. But we have to realize, when I sit in the hot seat, which is the school board seat, I see our community, our parents walking into these meetings and saying, you are teaching critical race theory. But as you heard from our presenters today, the critical race theory that we see in college and scholarly, it's not the same critical race theory they're quoting. And it's very, very sad, because I'll tell you this. We see that the truth is not being acknowledged. So I'm Dr. Joanna Dorado. I'm Latina. I'm LatinX, and you'll see that our history books often are very selective of the stories that are being taught. Right now, we live in California. I'm in a K through 12 system where our predominantly population, guys, let's acknowledge this, is Latinos. In California specifically, we have schools with large populations of ELs, and we have parents going to school board meetings saying, I think ethnic studies, I want to see the curriculum, I think it might be controversial. Our parents, I'm looking and hearing, what lens are they coming from? Because let's be aware, right now we have an audience, and some of us might be opposing ethnic studies. Let's be aware of our audience. I sit in the hot seat every day and know that right now our participants might very much be taking what we're saying, but they're contradicting every point, you know what I mean? So I've sat on board meetings, I've had parents of color, African American parents, I've seen board meetings where we've had, parents of color say, I do not want my child learning about this history. And let's sit and think about that. How, after this conversation of critical race theory, we've seen the what is it? Dr. Karras did a beautiful job introducing what is critical race theory. But how do we make it not as divisive right now, politically? This hot topic, like we said, Trump brought it forward, July of 2020, July of 2021, we've seen it just nationally, just be such a hot topic. How do we, as scholars, as leaders, as teachers, as board members, how do we make this topic not as divisive? Because where I sit right now, I want my K through 12 students to learn the stories that acknowledge there's racism, there's diversity, there's sexism. How do we instill these values? How do we show them the struggles that our ancestors have had? So the argument I hear from our parents are saying, well, those struggles aren't my struggles. So I've clearly heard someone say, hey, I came from a generation of slavery, but that is not my children's struggles. So please do not have my child feel or acknowledge that there's an inequality when that is not my story. But I mean, we've already talked about it. It's medical, it's system-wide systems that are still struggling. But these families specifically, they say, I don't want that story being told. You know, we came from a generation, we are, you know, of slavery, and we don't want that being taught. So I think that's the how. Let's go back to the how. How do we teach our young children values, respect, the struggles that our ancestors have gone? We live in a K through 12 system where there's high diversity, where most of our students are Latinos in some of our schools.
Those are good questions, and I'm sure our presenters are excited to really respond to that when we get to the Q&A. That's fantastic to bring it up, Dr. Dorado. That's good.
So I preface that, and let's keep the conversation going, because like I said, we sit in this board and we don't only hear from scholars, we hear from a very diverse group of people that maybe don't want to acknowledge this inequality still exists. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Musmi Day on AsianCrit.
Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. I'm, as Dr. Jose Lalas introduced me, I'm Dr. Moshmi Day. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning, the School of Education. As you can see, I am not white. I am Asian. And so I want to talk a little about AsianCrit, which is Asian critical race theory. We had very strict guidelines, about 5 to 7 minutes. So I'm going to do my best. So Heidi, may I request you to move to the next slide? Thank you. So what really is AsianCrit? So it's a critical race theory perspective that focuses on the racial and ethnic group of Asian Americans. And this was really because there wasn't a conceptual framework that focused on the racial realities of Asian Americans. Next, please. Now, a little about the history. So despite the 150 plus years of Asians in US history and anti-racism efforts, Asian Americans are really not included into the collective memory of who qualifies as an American. And if you look at the larger discussions of race, they've kind of revolved around black-white dichotomies, you know, like American means white and minority means black. Now, you know, Hispanics and LatinX included, but the notion of minority Asian Americans, it's like perpetual foreigners, or we say foreigners forever. They are not really seen authentic Americans. So based on Asian critical studies and critical race theory, a conceptual framework of Asian American critical race theory, or AsianCrit, was conceived. And that has like 7 interconnected tenets. And I think that's the real contribution of understanding what AsianCrit is. Next slide, please, Heidi. Okay. So one of the most important racializations, and that I have also faced, is this model minority myth. So what is model minority? It lumps Asian Americans together as successful, hardworking, law-abiding, and compliant minorities. You know, really, I don't want to go into more examples because we don't have the time. It is very flattering, but essentially what it does, it erases Asian Americans' long history of oppression and resistance, It denies contemporary racism against Asian Americans. It dismisses the diversity and complexity of the struggles within the Asian American community because it is extremely diverse. We have Indians, but we have South Koreans, we have Chinese, we have Japanese, we have Vietnamese, all with their own histories and problems, Japanese, etc. And most importantly, this is what really which I find very disconcerting, is that it sets Asian Americans against the struggles of other people of color in this country. Next slide, please. So the first tenet that AsianCrit theoretical framework came up with is Asianization. So what does the model minority myth do? It maintains white supremacy by casting Asian Americans as good minorities and casting other people of color as bad or problem, okay? And it blames other people of color for their struggles and silences their claims for social injustice. The second is the perpetual foreigner myth. Again, this also maintains white supremacy by reproducing the dominant narrative of American identity as being white, okay? What AsianCrit does is that it explicates, it explains and disrupts how white supremacy actually operates in shaping Asian American people's lives. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another tenet is reconstructive history. So as we all know that in CRT, we try to deconstruct history. But as far as Asian Americans are concerned, we're trying to actually construct the case of Asian Americans in history and in other narratives, because there's really nothing much to deconstruct in the first place. So what AsianCrit does, it seeks to transcend invisibility by constructing a collective Asian American historical narrative. But equally important is this other tenet to understand is strategic anti-essentialism. So I want to explain this a little bit. When we think about essentialism, so there is no essential experience or attribute that defines any specific group of people, right? Like we don't have like only black people face this, but it's very complex. Everyone has potentially conflicting, overlapping identities, loyalties, and allegiances, right? So with Asians, like I especially found this image, it is amazing because it is so diverse. So we note the oppressive nature of pan-ethnicity, in the fight towards social justice. However, what AsianCrit does, because we don't really have a history, it employs identity politics to empower the disempowered. So that's why we have this all-inclusive. That's why it's called the strategic anti-essentialism. Next slide, please, Heidi. Another, tenet is the story, theory, and praxis. So AsianCrit, like CRT, what it does is it promotes counter story as a tool for exposing, analyzing, and challenging the majority's story and white privilege. It brings the voices of Asian Americans and works of Asian American scholars to deconstruct and construct the dominant discourse or narrative or story. So it aligns with CRT's transformative response to racial, gender, and class oppression, upholding the rights of the oppressed. And here, actually, I want to add the seventh tenet, which is intersectionality, because I had very strict instructions to reduce from 11 to like 5 or 6 slides. So I had to get rid of that because I think everyone understands intersectionality. So AsianCrit also aligns with that. The other is the commitment to social justice. Just like CRT, AsianCrit joins this fight for social justice, addressing racism and other forms of oppression, and it specifically focuses on the ground realities of Asian Americans. I don't have the slide, the last slide, because I had to have a minimum. I had to maintain a maximum. But what I want to do is I want to conclude this introduction to AsianCrit with certain implications for teachers. Like I have just 3 questions that I would like all of us to kind of examine. One is, what can teachers do in their classrooms to address racism, oppression against Asian Americans, and also their own positionality in culturally responsive teaching toward Asian Americans? Okay, I often give this example in my classroom. I spent a lot of time in Indiana. And, sometimes like teachers would get very angry and they would have their certain gestures that they would use for the class to pay attention. And they would say, look into my eyes. It's like everyone's like, they will stop doing whatever they're doing. Say, look into my eyes. Asians would never do that because Asian children grow up with this idea that you have to respect your elders, you have to respect your teachers, and especially if they're angry, they will feel shameful and they will bow down and put their eyes, they will never maintain contact. And then if the teacher is not culturally responsive or culturally informed, the teacher usually gets even more angry because the teacher is saying that the student is not obeying. So, there are these subtle ways in which not knowing about a certain culture, let's say the Pan-Asian American culture, is going to affect the way teaching and learning happens in the classroom. The second question is, how can teachers use these 7 tenets of AsianCrit framework into their own classroom practice? This is a really broad examination and something that, it deserves a much wider discourse and discussion. And the last is for us higher educators, like what can we do as higher educators to include AsianCrit, of course, along with other crits, into the teacher education preparation program? So that's all. I hope I have been successful in meeting my 5-minute deadline.
Thank you, Dr. Day. Thank you very much for your very clear explanation. And it's a survey. I'm sure there'll be follow-up webinars on it, just like the other crit. All right. Now we have Dr. Kimia Magzi. Of course, disability critical race theory is also a very, very significant and important work that we have to do. Dr. Magzi?
Great. I'm happy to be here, and I think disability is such an important topic to think about as it affects all of us, regardless of the color of our skin, the language we speak, and it affects our students in the classroom. So thinking about your own lives, like disability might affect you personally, whether you may have a disability or your loved ones may have a disability, or you may know someone, a friend that has a disability. So this is where I feel very passionate personally about the disability studies and critical race theory. And this merging of disability studies and critical race theory is called DisCrit, where race and disability are acknowledged as both being socially constructed categories. And so we as educators really need to examine how race and disability play out in our society and in our classrooms. And so DisCrit really offers a more nuanced way of reading race and ability in our schools and in society. And so this concept of racism and ableism, they're both forms of discrimination that exist within our society and affect our schooling systems. And we need to recognize that ableism does exist. And it's this idea of discrimination against this able-bodied, Sorry, discrimination in favor of the able-bodied people. So just as we need to examine how race plays out in the classroom, we also need to examine how a disability and this intersection of this work is DisCrit. Can we go to the next slide? So if you think about the special education classroom, there's a overrepresentation of students of color in special ed classrooms. So when you their overrepresentation of students of color is much less likely in disability categories that are sensory or physical in name. For example, individuals who are visually impaired or blind, individuals who are hard of hearing or deaf, or individuals who have physical impairments. This fact alone is just evidence that race and perceived ability or lack thereof are still connected within educational structures and practices today, albeit in much more subtle ways. So we really, as educators, need to question, how are we deciding and labeling students? How are we going about labeling students? Are we culturally responsive professionals who are recognizing students' funds of knowledge, who are recognizing our students' prior knowledge and backgrounds? Are we getting to know our students? Who are these individuals that are labeling our students? Because if we look at the statistics, African-American students are 67% more likely than white students to be labeled as having emotional disturbance or having behavior problems, and oftentimes removed from schools, the classroom, and the school grounds. They're 13 more times more likely than white students to be arrested in schools. So these are just statistics that show the problematic nature of not only our labeling, but also what students are put into special education classrooms. Can we go to the next slide, please? So disability categories in general, whether they be physical, cognitive, sensory, are all subjective. What I'm saying is, we as professionals, so-called professionals, are making these judgment calls, so these disability categories are really subjective in nature. They rely on the subjective judgment of school personnel rather than biological fact. We can say that these individuals are quote unquote clinically trained and determined, but based on their professional judgment, these students are labeled. But guess what? Each professional has their own lens through which they see the world around them. So their biases come into play when we're making these labels, when we're making these decisions of who has what labels in the classroom. And also these categories are constantly shifting over time. If you think about the image that I have here of mental retardation, we don't use that term anymore. Rosa's Law, President Obama passed Rosa's Law, now we call it intellectual disability. But this chart shows you that overnight, individuals who are told their whole life that they had this label of MR, an intellectual disability, overnight, the threshold for what qualified them, their IQ score of changed. So we have from 85 to 70. And that was really, that shift happened because this shift actually shows the social constructive nature of disability. It's a category that's man-made, that overnight we can change the threshold of who qualifies, what score qualifies as like being labeled with this label of MR. And so essentially the people who were labeled as MR, overnight their condition was quote unquote cured. Again, this change was largely as a result of special education being critiqued for overrepresenting students of color in their programs for students with intellectual disabilities. So racism and ableism are so intermeshed in the fabric of our society and the order of our society, and it's become quote unquote normal or normalized. And so what can we do as educators to turn normalcy upside down on its head? Can we go to the next slide? So you have this image, like this cow's turned upside down. We as educators need to challenge these taken for granted assumptions of normalcy. We have to be that cow that turns normal upside down on its head. We have to really look at racism, disability, ableism, and we need to start questioning our practices and how we go about labeling students. And so DisCrit actually offers 7 tenets that I'm going to put into the chat, but it's a way that we can go about addressing the structural powers of ableism and racism, and recognizing how history, social, political forces, economic interests all play a role into the oppression of our students with disabilities, and a layered oppression for our students who are students of color with disabilities, and how their experiences are very unique. And we need to bring the voices of these marginalized individuals to the forefront. So I'm going to put a link in the
That's it.
chat.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Magsi. As you can tell, these are the principles of CRT really laid out by Dr. Clay already. But this is just a review that race and racism is inherent in American society, according to CRT. There's critical examination of the problems caused by neutrality, objectivity, color blindness, focus on maintaining commitment to social justice, the importance of counter storytelling, and lastly, whiteness as property. So those are the principles of CRT that we learned this evening, as well as I would like to thank Dr. Greg Hamilton for laying out the queer critical theory as well, which we're not able to cover this evening. I would like to turn in now to our discussions. I know we don't have enough time, but I want you to really go around with the five of you to give your comments and maybe a critical question that is burning that you want to ask. All right? You want to start from Mr. Hedrick?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Lawless. I have learned a lot this evening. I do have a question that I would like to put forward. I understand that increasing the diversity within our workforce will make a substantial difference in how many of these issues are addressed and perceived. To that end, I wonder what any of the panelists believe might be the most effective role for an ally to play in bringing these counter stories to the forefront, especially for permanent employees of school districts. As you know, non-tenured employees can be dismissed for any reason in their first 2 years of employment. For those with a bit more courage and with the protection of permanent status, how would you encourage them to alter their practice?
Yeah, that question is very connected to Joanna and Dr. Dorado's question as well. So if someone from the panel would like to give it a shot.
I'll be happy to give it a shot. Read Barry Boy's article. He talks about the difference between listening and hearing, and that's really important because the fact of the matter is people from different cultures speak different ways, and it's kind of like what some of the panelists discuss here too, different cultural practices. And like I have a whole chapter in my book on Anishinaabe ways of knowing and being about Anishinaabe rhetoric. Our ways of talking are different. If you don't understand that, you won't be able to get it. And just one quick story. I gave a talk to a bunch of mental health people who were supposed to serve Native Americans. I spoke like an Indian. All the Indians said, that was a great talk. All the non-Indians said, that sucked. These are supposed to be people who are addressing mental health concerns for Native Americans. They don't even know how to listen to natives. So I directed to Gregory's article and the importance of the difference between listening and hearing.
Okay, very good. Any other, somebody who wants to give it a crack? Okay, Dr. Day.
Actually, when you say that, they sucked, they said it sucks. If you just, I mean, the way I see it is that it really hurt them, and that's why they had that feeling. When it really reaches them at an affective level, and that's when they realize that, because if it makes you feel uncomfortable, that means you've actually reached them at a certain, at a certain level. That's what I feel.
Maybe not. I don't know how often I've been dismissed, denigrated, devalued because I speak like an Indian.
Can I just add, the question was, how do we get tenured teachers and non-tenured teachers to speak about, or how to be allies? Was that the question, Bill? By the way, hi, Bill. Shout out to my sister, Lorette.
How are you? Yes, that's the question. How to be the most effective allies in the absence of the diverse workforce that we all want to see?
I would say to push for curriculum and to push for spaces that are inclusive. And also to encourage hiring committees to hire more Black and Brown folks. That's one way to be an ally, but also to push the limit when it comes to having conversations about inclusive history. And when we go to these curriculum meetings, to have open conversations about this publisher is not doing a good job in representing all voices. That's one way an ally can stand on the front line and say, I don't see this voice, I don't see that voice. What can we do about it? So that's one way. And then to talk to administration and district folks about like opening those doors and supporting Black and Brown teachers, new teachers, into staying, because a lot of times they feel invisible and they feel like they don't have a space. So how do we retain the Black and Brown faculty that we have?
I know others would like to chime in, but let me move on to the next discussant, and probably some ideas will come about as well. Dr. Fortner, comments and burning question that you have.
Hi, everybody. It's been a wonderful, wonderful evening, and I'm not going to belay everything because I thought it was just well laid out and well placed. I do want to reflect a little bit on Dr. Hamilton's discussion about the history and the picture that he shared at the very beginning of the Haitian and the cowboy. And for me as a leader and at Cal State Dominguez Hills, I, like Angela Luke, I am working with school leaders, and I am hoping to make a change of their mindset and their dispositions and their understandings as they move into schools. And so one of the things that CRT can help us to do in the school is it helps us to see that there has been a general sanctioning of the brutality that's embedded in the fabric of our nation. And those things that take place, those things that have been happening, we see them and we kind of almost gloss over them or when we see them, we're totally in shock because we haven't been taught the true history of our nation. And so many of you spoke about the roots that CRT can help us to see when we look at counter stories and when we look at what's actually happening through historical events in the law. And I want to also bring that into education. And Dr. Bullock, Ayana, you just talked about the curriculum. CRT helps us to see that erasure of the contribution of people of color. I think Dr. Day, I think that's your name, I think you spoke about that too in the Asian population, the erasure of people of color, their contributions in history, but also the prioritization of white people and their achievements and their works. So in this erasure of what's taking place with people of color have this feeling of inferiority, and it does continue that feeling of, and when I say people of color, I mean anyone who does not say that they are white. And I won't go into my whole idea of racism and all that, but anyone who is not white, it's an erasure of your history. So your history has not been told. And my history has been told, but it's been told with such a deficit mindset that I block out history. I blocked out my history classes. And when I got to college, I had to have a tutor because the history that I was taught was not something that I wanted to believe about the people that looked like me. And so I think that when we think about curriculum and when we think about what we can do and how CRT can help us to frame this, when we use it as a lens, when we use it as a tool to help us to uproot and deconstruct some of the history that we think is true and reconstruct a story that tells us, I think that those are some of the things that we need to really consider when we think about CRT. And that's some of the things that I do with my candidates. And so hearing that from both the historical and from the educational lens, I'm able to pull those two together and to say that, yes, we can if we will truly look at what CRT is and not what is being what's been placed in front of us by this right wing or this group of people who want to continue to hold on to this racism and racist beliefs that in our system. It's not just the people, but in our system.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to give an opportunity for Dr. Solomon to ask, to give her comments as well. And I know we're running out of time, but if you can bear with us a few more minutes so we can wrap it up and have people's voices heard. Dr. Solomon? Comments from you?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to just respond to Dr. Day's presentation on the AsianCrit. And in that context, I want to just mention this, critical race theory talks about interest convergence theory, which really refers to the dominant white culture can tolerate minority successes only if those successes benefit them. And I believe the model, Asian, culture, or the Asians in general fall into that. Because, you know that many of them are very successful because they work hard and so on. They have contributed to the white culture's, the growth and the economy and everything. But in that, how does and still you are seen as a foreigner. You're never accepted as a full-fledged American. Always seen as a foreigner. So this is the key concern of Asian Americans in this country. How do we change this? And I believe, the changing our narratives. I think that research is the biggest asset in that. Please, Jean and it talks about looking at things critically, critical analysis to bring into research. And I think that is a very important way. And to build bridges and working with other minority groups. How do we reconcile with this? How do we live together as one people? How do we build this? These are the challenges. And so, only way to building bridges between all the communities and working together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Solomon. You've hit a very important point. I think there is something that has not been discussed a lot, and I think more and more people need to be aware about this. Just expanding upon what Dr. Solomon said, we are brown. We are these foreigners. We are seen as minorities, but actually we have extremely privileged background from our home countries. And that is a very important factor that is often ignored. Because if you look at the history, I can talk about Indians. Please forgive me. I can't talk about all other cultures within American Asian community. A lot of the Indians, when they came, they were engineers. So you have people, you have parents, you have both parents who are working. They have a lot of privileges. I consider myself as somebody who has white privilege inside India. Somebody who has so many degrees, who already have, it's like a lot of people who come, who are successful minorities, they already have a privileged background, and that has helped them succeed. And that background is not necessarily the same as what other minorities have. And this is something that is often ignored. So we need to acknowledge our own privileges as South Asians, Southeast Asians, and that would be a slightly more authentic way of, I guess, I don't know, being authentic, So,
my point was, our contribution has helped the white community, the larger culture in many ways, our success, the Asian success.
Yes.
But still you're not given equal rights. You're still seen as a foreigner. So that is the dilemma that an Asian deals with. That's what, but we can overcome. There are ways to overcome, and I think that, and we've done, this is, having webinars like this and raising our concerns and expressing our views are very, very important. And I think, I'm so glad Dr. Lawless did this, and we have to have more of this.
I would like to say something. I believe we all need to work towards the inclusion of all voices, whether it be people of color, black and brown folks. And I think oftentimes people with disabilities are left out of this conversation. If we think about again, disability affects all of us. And so when I'm thinking of Dr. Ayana and how she said, we need more Black and brown folks to be hired. Also, when we're hiring, we need to represent all different types of bodies, whether that be able-bodied, whether that be individuals with dis/abilities, because we need to problematize also how disability is viewed in our culture. And then having those people at our discussions, at our consultation tables, can also help us think of different perspectives, differing needs. For example, push us to think of accessibility, push us to think of inclusion. What does inclusion look like, whether it be when thinking about all forms of differences? And I think as K-12 educators, as professors at the university, as the U of R, we need to push ourselves to think of inclusion across all categories, across all levels of difference. And ultimately, we're all human beings. We all have, we all are striving to be better, right? And so we can only push each other to be better. And so that means all voices need to be at the table. We need to hear from those that are marginalized.
Very good. Yeah. Have to talking about mindset. I just wanted to just mention this mindset. Building mindset that is inclusive is the greatest challenge for educators. All of us, white, brown, yellow, all of us, red, all of us coming together. The mindset, we have to create a mindset.
Okay. Yes, I would like to hear from another discussant, either, Dr. Lynn or Dr. Joanna Dorado.
I have
words of wisdom.
Just a quick comment, and maybe some words of wisdom. So, as a board member, I sit on a board where I'm recently tasked, to come up with a descriptive characteristic of who we're going to be putting on our cabinet. So we're going to have a hiring committee, and you know what? Some of the things that come to mind is sex, right? Are we going to have diversity in our females? Are we having, but you know what? I thank you for the enlightenment. I never thought about, hey, are we hiring someone with a known disability? I mean, that's not something that comes to mind when we're creating a characteristic of our new, a superintendent, of a cabinet member, and of assistant superintendent. So thank you for enlightening me. And those were my final remarks. And something that I didn't bring home is something that's dear to my heart. Thank you, Dr. Lawless, for bringing this up. But we recently in the news, there was a Moreno Valley case where females went to Temecula schools for a athletic event, and they were mistreated based on this concept of that we are still segregated. Just naturally, students in Moreno Valley high schools tend to be more students of color, African American. They went to play at a visitor game in Temecula where maybe censorship, right? We're not learning about, the educators, right? We perpetuate. So I just wanted to bring it home with that, and why it sits close to my heart to have these conversations in our K-12 system. And that's all I wanted to comment on. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lynn?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. The panel was amazing, and I always love learning. But I just wanted to comment on what Dr. Blockman said. It's like, how do we ensure that we're not teaching from a deficit lens? Because, our curriculum, it is Eurocentric. And I know you brought up LCAP and other, school site council, ELAC, and so on. And I think as site leaders, we are able to have a say in that at our site. So yes, HR, does the hiring, and the board approves things, and the board gets approved by the communities, different communities that are represented. But that's one of the initiatives that I have really focused on as a site leader is how do I bring different, diversity, and how do I bring my EL parents into my school site council meetings? How do I bring them into our PTA executive board? Because we know that PTA is associated with only our white parents. We know that if we've been in education long enough. We know that ELAC, we usually have our Spanish speaking, if you live in a Spanish speaking community or multilingual community. And so I think we can do that. We can do that with our school site council. We can do that with our single plan for student achievement. Of course, we have to support our district initiatives, and I work in a district where our superintendent has worked really hard to make sure that equity is our #1 priority in bringing that diversity into our school. But I know not all of us have the same position with our superintendents or our board. And I think we can start there because I can control which teacher I want to hire or classified person or counselor or campus monitor or yard supervisor. I'm able to write the plan with the team, with my leadership, with my school site council, with ELAC, PTA. So it's really focusing on what are we able to do in this, micro setting, but then extend that into our other schools and communities. So thank you for bringing that up and suggesting that, Dr. Blockman, because it really brings it back to what my focus is. And I have my school site council on Monday, so I'm gonna make sure that I bring this up. But also, for elementary, I have a comment for the panel. I know teaching inclusivity and history is a focus of CRT, but how do we do that do it in a way where for educators in general that is not threatening to them, but they have the understanding that we need to provide these views and this diversity, because if we're not giving our students a voice. So how do we do that work as school leaders and educators in the higher education programs?
Well, okay, thank you for staying. Might as well maximize it. I want to really go around and see if you can say a minute of words of wisdom on your part to tell our audience who are still here. Still, we have 129 people still. So let's start from the very beginning. Any words of wisdom that you want to leave our audience and our friends and our colleagues here? I can call names.
I'll just finish real quick, Dr. Lawless. I think understanding that everyone has a voice and everyone needs to be heard. And if we start with just as simple as that, no matter the situation, then we're able to validate the funds of knowledge that everyone brings and validate feelings.
Everyone has a voice.
Dr. Lawless.
Yes, yes, Mr. Bill Hedrick.
Yes, in regard to the last comment, look, American history and our colonial history, every aspect of it needs to be taught, warts and all. It needs to be taught, and anything that challenges American exceptionalism, the story that we have grown up with, is going to get pushed back. And so I think when you go into a classroom or you're at a university, you are, in a sense, on the front line. You need to be committed to making a difference. And I just think very strongly that good teaching is telling the truth. If we're going to lie to students about the history, we're not doing a good job. And at the end of the day, I think that this is a struggle worth engaging in. And I think that we will prevail in changing the future. And while you cannot do that by erasing the past, and in age, for administrators who are concerned and school boards that get pushed back, the truth is it's about age appropriate instruction. And when it's truthful and age appropriate, we are all going to win, and the country's going to be stronger in the end.
Good, thank you, Mr. Hedrick. Angela?
I'll say a few words if I may.
Larry, okay, Larry.
I'll keep it relatively short. Two things in my classrooms, I teach about the genocide of Native Americans. What do I say is, we're not going to dwell in the past. We're not going to play the blame game. We're not going to get stuck in the past. What we do is we acknowledge the past in order to imagine a better future, to work toward in the present. And that better future is not just for Native people, it's for you, your family, your community, and your place. And the second thing is, what I taught in Iowa and in Montana, and what I found was that you know, those a lot of those white kids were losing their land, their farms, their ranches, and etc. Same thing is happening with auto workers. So what sometimes what I tell my students is, you know, basically they got our ancestors over here to develop this land, and now that it's developed, these rich people are coming in and taking it. Same thing with the auto workers. What they found is that they thought their white skin would be a protection for them against the worst excesses of global capitalism. They found out it's not true. So what I say is Indians and farmers need to be talking to each other. Indian and ranchers need to be talking to each other. Indians and displaced auto workers, factory workers need to be talking to each other. And then that way we can start to develop, you know, a better future for all people. And it really starts with each of us telling our story, like it says in critical race theory. So again, this is something I would encourage churches to do, to bring in people from different communities to tell their own story, so we can start to reconstitute or actually better develop this notion that actually we all are Americans. We're all in this together. Thank you.
That's a good one. Dr. Lawless, in
Yes.
terms of legal, I mean, scholarship, multiple perspectives have to be included. This is very, very important. Multiple perspectives have to be included to bring the ins and outs of racism in the society and how we can eliminate it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lawless. I appreciate this opportunity. Let me just end my comments with saying many of us want our children to go to college or to be educated. Well, usually attending universities, the curriculum, those experiences broaden our knowledge base and broaden our thoughts, you know? And so when we have those kinds of opportunities and send our children off to college, why is it that we think they can't handle the truth? I think they can. So when students come through the programs, I'm not saying all of them, but we want them to be able to handle the truth, all of the truth, because this is their awakening time. When you go off to college, this is your awakening time. And a good instructor and an effective instructor is able to, and should be trained to, I must say, to teach the topic and the content in a way that creates critical thought, analysis, and reflection. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Dr. Luke. Comments? Good.
A lot has been said, but I wanted to share that I want to make sure that whatever we do, we don't silence with our fancy words and sophisticated language to try to advocate for our group, that we don't silence any other groups. And so what I say is, and I'm speaking just from my own lived experience, someone says Black Lives Matter, another person says all lives matter, and the intentionality is there is the suggestion that when we're saying Black Lives Matter, we're saying anti something. When we're saying pro, let's say, ability, you know, we want to talk about advocating for ableism and advocating against ableism, we want to quiet the voices of folks who are able-bodied. That's not necessarily the case. That's definitely not the case, right? But something about being Black in this country, the essence of my being walks in before I do. Before I say a word, I've already said a lot just because I stood in the room. If I walk into a Rotary meeting, if you're a Rotarian, I apologize, I don't mean to offend you. It says a lot. And within 5 to 10 seconds, I know if my presence is desired or not, based on nothing other than the complexion of my skin. And it's killing me to hear people make comments about racism, sexism, you know, all these different isms, and say, well, you know, okay, we're kind of done. George Floyd is over. We've been living in a dual state this entire time. And I know many groups have, but I just want to focus on anti-Blackness for a moment, because anti-Blackness impacts Latinos, anti-Blackness impacts Indigenous folks, anti-Blackness impacts, if you don't say a word and your color is dark, you experience it, period. It is something that just has a strong presence in our nation. And I don't want us to silence one another while advocating for our groups. I just want to make sure that we as advocates really link arm in arm and we create voices for one another. And if we see an absence in the voice who's not at the table, we should always be worried about the silenced people. So for me, I think it's extremely important, if we're talking about the hiring practices, don't bring in these experts from different groups and pay them at the lowest rate possible. I don't care what your superintendent said. Do not discourage them from participating and being able to make a means of living for themselves. That's what happens to us. That's what happens to minorities in this nation. We get the lowest wage possible, while another organization is a big, organization, gets paid the top dollar. You can see it. You see it all day long if you're working in our K-12 system. If you go through the finance department, you get to see who gets compensated and who doesn't. And it's most times the darker you are, the less you get compensated. So I think it's going to be us that makes the biggest difference in our ability to be willing to have those courageous conversations. I saw Dr. Hamilton typed in the chat. We have to advocate, period. We have to advocate and create a voice for one another. And it cannot be limited to just our own experience. So here, let me tell you this real quick. As a parent in our K-12 system, I have a specific district. I was a parent in their high school for 9 years. I started going to the ELAG meetings, the DLAG meetings. Listen, me and those parents didn't speak the same language. I got the headphones and I was like, typing the principal. I need this in English. I need this in Spanish for my friend who can't hear and understand what's being said. When I showed up to a meeting and I saw that they had the child translating, we got to fix this. Her son does not want to tell his mother what's going on. You cannot allow that to be the interpretive service. So advocating for each other is, I think, going to be one critical key. And I heard what you said, Larry. I love what you said. We have to link arm in arm, and it has to be across our different groups that we're advocating for.
Good. Right?
Man.
Getting better and better. There we go.
Ready? Go. Okay. I just want to say, in the spirit of CRT and while we're all here, the foundation has been laid for us. Critical race theory is just about making sure we're all heard and our voices and narratives are told in our history, in our classrooms. Some of the things, culturally relevant, responsive instruction needs to be taught in the colleges before teachers get to the classrooms. That needs to be an expectation. And it can't be that I'm lecturing my teachers or teachers who are about in the teacher prep program all day without demonstrating culturally responsive practices. The actual professors need to know this as well, because they can't expect their students who are going to be teachers to learn how to be culturally responsive if they're not culturally responsive. That means you need to have a diverse pool. Also, I want to say that we need to expect excellence, and it's about all of our democracy. I've heard the beautiful thing, all of these different crits that have come from critical race theory. Black people, that's who we are. We're inclusive. Everybody's included, and we love everybody. That's just our nature. And so with critical race theory having so many branches, like everyone said, we need to lock arms and make sure all of us are at the table. And we also need to make sure that folks who are struggling, we are there to help and pull them up and support them and not ostracize them in silence, because it's about all of our liberation. Our democracy isn't on defense right now. It's under attack. 27 states have already proven that. And if we don't lock arms, we will be looking at the fight for all of our own liberation. And so that's what this is all about. Liberating ourselves. And that's it.
Thank you.
Diana, good for you.
Anyone else who would like to say, Dr. Maxey?
Just hearing everyone speak, I think about, first of all, our students of color who have disabilities and how they face layered oppression. So I think about as educators, what was the heavy responsibility we have to work together for the betterment of our Black and brown students and for all our students as well. and to work towards addressing racism, which is the most challenging issue of our society, I think, and ableism as well, because ableism runs across all these isms. So we all have a duty to, as parents, as educators, as human beings, to work towards the betterment of of the world, of our society, for all our children, especially our Black and brown children who have continued to be marginalized.
Right, I'm respectful of everybody's time, but is there someone who would like to give the last, or maybe before I turn it into Dr. Strickwerda, who has some announcement to save the date? Anyone else? Dr. Strickwerda, want to share our save the date?
Our amazing teachers who are teaching through COVID. I just want to say that. Thank you, Lorette.
Oh, yeah, it's a lot more. And it's a lot more that we need to talk. But you all covered this. You all covered it.
I wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about how we can capture this new spirit and vision in post-pandemic era. We're kind of still in the pandemic, but we're moving towards hopefully post-pandemic, right? Where these inequalities between race and social class have been exacerbated. I've been reading the book by Cornel West called Race Matters, and a lot of the concepts that have been discussed through critical race theory are embedded in his thought. So he has this 1, 2, 3s of basically what we can do about it. What can we do about addressing these issues? And the first point before we get into that is I'm hearing a lot of hope in this room, right? And so before we can even inspire others or engage in the struggle, we have to believe that we can engage in the struggle. We have to believe that we can make a difference. And so first we have to believe that we ourselves are the most valuable resources for change, that we are the ones who inspire hope, and we are the ones that have the abilities and the skills to help and the power and knowledge needed to solve these issues that impact our society and our commonalities within our common history. And so believing in our self-worth and being valued of who we are, coming to the table with the understanding that just look in this room, right? Everyone in here has so much to contribute. We have the knowledge and the ideas to be able to handle these issues if we believe that we do that together. So as a principal, when I work with my staff, I always approach our problems with this way. I believe that my staff has the knowledge and abilities that we just have to feel valued in a safe space to be able to contribute and come to solve these problems. Second, we must focus our attention on the public square, meaning the common good for our communities and the qualities of lives for our children, right? How we have to put our efforts in educating our youth, cleaning our common spaces, not neglecting our public infrastructure, the water, the sewage, the streets, the subways, all of these things that impede productivity and help us to internalize our beliefs of who we are by our environment or where we're located or what resources we have. So focusing our intention on our common communities and the qualities of life is the second step. And third, Cornel West talks about raising up new visionary leaders. And I added caring because we can't, address anything if we don't have the heart or the equity heart or that genuine caringness. And we have to mentor these new visionary caring leaders who can situate themselves within the larger social and historical narratives of this country and of our world. People who understand the dynamics that we're facing and are unafraid to speak the truth in love and face these daring obstacles. So those are 3 points that Cornel West makes: believing in ourselves, focus our attention on the common good, and then raising up new caring leaders to be able to address the needs of the communities that are socially and historically situated. And we always end these webinars with this quote from Paulo Freire, Education does not transform the world. Education changes people, and people change the world. So our next event for Save the Day is October 27th. This is going to be on ethnic studies. I saw a lot of comments in the chat about what about ethnic studies? How does the curriculum play within critical race theory? Those are great questions. We're going to be talking about that on October 27th. Assemblyman Jose Medina, one of the authors of California Assembly Bill 101, will be present. And it's important for students to examine the formation process of ethnic minorities in a variety of contexts: political, legal, social, historical, economic, and cultural. So that's going to be discussed. It is also important for students to understand the impact of race, ethnicity, class, gender, and their interaction among different ethnic groups and their experiences. So very similar to the conversation that we were having tonight, just expanded into a more specific topic of ethnic studies and high school graduation requirements.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Heidi. As I've said, this is like a survey of the different crits, and it's really hard to stay on top of the time because all of you have the passion and all the information that you want to share, and we're all respectful of each other's ideas. And so I'm sure there'll be follow-up sessions and all of this. And I know it's short notice, but when we were publicizing all of this, we got a letter from Australia wanting to write something about this. You know, so I'll be contacting all of you. You have all kinds of ideas. I was jotting down notes, and as I received the letter inviting a book to be written on this matter, that is something that I think all of you will welcome because you all have the ideas and passion to make a difference, to inform people around the world of the good things that we do and we demonstrate and think about with regards to the involvement of CRT and race and disability in analyzing the impact of those matters in the schooling of our children. I would like to end by making a quote from my background. It's a kind of radical, but I really like it. It says, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, and you just talked about all kinds of injustices, if you remain neutral in those situations, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. So with that, I would like to thank all of you again for your involvement, and thank you. I appreciate you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you all.
It was
on behalf of the University of Redlands, we thank all of you. And
very enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you. Rialto.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, Heidi, can you send us the chat? Like when you save this chat, can you send that to us?
It's a good one.
Yeah, that was my question too. I was hoping I would be able to.
There's a lot of great resources in there. So.
Yes.
Oh, you're muted, Heidi.
Okay, I'll see y'all again.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, Larry. Thank you.
Thank you. See you again. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Did you say yes, Heidi? You can?
Yes, I'll do that right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Have a good evening. It went really, really well, Dr. Lawless. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Lots of active people. Thank you, Ingrid, for the last minute invitation. Thank you.
I think she left to go home because she was still at work. So I think she had to leave. Yeah. Take care, you guys.
Good night.
Good night, Kitty.
Good night.
Just let me make sure I copied and pasted right before we close this out.
Was it recorded, Heidi?